burial shroud, thick enough to taste. In the pre-dawn darkness, the rumble began, a deep, mechanical thunder that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Frost clung to the skeletal branches of birch trees lining the road into the village of Coburg, and the air smelled of diesel fuel, wet earth, and something else, the acrid residue of a world burning itself clean. From behind the curtains of timber-framed houses, eyes watched. German civilians, hollow-cheeked and silent, pressed their faces to cold glass as the column approached. They had heard tanks before. They had seen Wehrmacht convoys retreat in shame. But they had never seen this. The Sherman tanks of the 761st Tank Battalion rolled through the morning mist like iron gods, their tracks chewing frozen mud, their cannon still warm from the fight at Tilley. But it wasn't the tanks that made old Frau Bergmann clutch her rosary. It wasn't the 50 caliber machine guns or the white stars painted on olive drab hulls. It was the men inside them. Black men, American soldiers, warriors whose very existence the Reich had spent 12 years denying was possible. And as the lead tank, call sign Cool Stud, passed the town square, something unprecedented happened. Herr Müller, former Ortsgruppenleiter of the local Nazi party, a man who had stood in that very square and cheered when the Nuremberg laws were announced, stepped into the street. His hand, trembling, rose to his forehead. He saluted. Not the stiff-armed Hitler Gruß he had performed 1,000 times before. A military salute. A gesture of respect. Behind him, one by one others emerged from doorways and did the same. The war in Europe was entering its final desperate phase, but in that moment, something else was ending too. A lie so fundamental to Nazi ideology that its collapse would echo longer than the fall of Berlin itself. To understand what happened on the roads of Bavaria in early 1945, one must first understand what the German people had been taught about race, about warfare, and about the natural order of the world. For 12 years, the machinery of the Third Reich had pumped a single narrative into every classroom, every newspaper, every radio broadcast. The Aryan race stood at the apex of human civilization, and the African race, die Neger, represented its lowest point. In the twisted taxonomy of Nazi racial pseudoscience, black people were classified as Untermenschen, subhumans, biologically incapable of civilization, courage, or military prowess. This wasn't casual prejudice. It was state doctrine, codified in law, taught in universities, illustrated in textbooks with fraudulent skull measurements and fabricated evolutionary charts. German children learned that black soldiers were primitive, cowardly, suitable only for menial labor. The Nazi propaganda machine depicted African troops in the French colonial forces as savages, barely restrained by their European masters. When the Wehrmacht swept through France in 1940, capturing thousands of African colonial troops, they were often murdered on the spot, not as casualties of war, but as vermin to be exterminated. The Rhineland bastards, children of German mothers and African soldiers from the post-World War I occupation, were forcibly sterilized. This was the gospel of the Reich. Racial hierarchy wasn't just policy, it was natural law. So when the first reports reached German commanders in late 1944 that the Americans had deployed an all-black tank battalion to the European theater, the response ranged from mockery to disbelief. Tanks required technical sophistication, split-second decision-making, courage under fire. Qualities the Nazi worldview insisted black men simply did not possess. Intelligence officers dismissed the reports as propaganda or assumed these were labor units misidentified in the fog of war. Even as the 761st fought its way across France, through the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge and into the German heartland, Wehrmacht commanders refused to update their racial calculus. They expected these units to break easily, to flee under pressure, to prove the Reich's theories correct. They expected wrong. The 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, had activated at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana in April 1942, a Jim Crow base where black soldiers trained with obsolete equipment and endured the daily humiliations of American segregation. They couldn't eat in the same mess halls as white soldiers. They couldn't use the same latrines. In the nearby town of Alexandria, they couldn't drink from the same water fountains. General George S. Patton himself, a man whose personal views on race were complex and often contradictory, inspected them before deployment and delivered a characteristic speech. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I don't care what color you are, as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down. And damn you, don't let me down." Patton's words carried a bitter irony these men understood in their bones. They were being asked to fight for freedom in a nation that denied them theirs. They would liberate concentration camps while knowing their own families back home couldn't vote in half the states of the Union. But they went anyway. They went because they believed, perhaps naively, perhaps prophetically, that their service might crack open a door their children could walk through. They arrived in France in October 1944 and were immediately thrown into combat in Lorraine. The welcome they received from white American units was often colder than the weather. Some commanders refused to work with them. Logistics officers lost their supply requisitions. They received the worst bivouac areas, the least rest time, the most dangerous assignments. It was warfare on two fronts, the Germans ahead and racism behind. But the 761st had something the Wehrmacht hadn't anticipated. They were fighting for something more than territory. Every shell they fired, every objective they took, every day they survived was a hammer blow against the ideology that said they couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. By November 1944, they had been in continuous combat for 183 days, longer than any other armored unit in Patton's Third Army. They expected to be rotated out. Instead, they were sent to the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's final gamble in the West, a massive counteroffensive through the snow-choked Ardennes forest designed to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. It was launched on December 16, 1944, in weather so savage that Allied air superiority was grounded. German panzer divisions smashed through American lines, creating chaos and terror. The 761st found themselves at the critical junction of Tilley, Belgium, a road hub the Germans needed to maintain their momentum. For 6 days, the Black Panthers held Tilley against everything the Wehrmacht threw at them. Panzer IVs, Tiger tanks, waves of infantry supported by artillery. The Germans attacked with the desperation of a regime facing extinction. The temperatures dropped to 15 below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Ammunition ran low. Sleep became a dangerous luxury. The tankers ate snow and fired until their barrels glowed red. They expected reinforcement. They expected relief. They got neither. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, commanding a Sherman tank, was hit by German artillery on the third day. Shrapnel tore through his leg, nearly severing it. Medical officers ordered evacuation. Rivers refused. He wrapped the wound in whatever cloth he could find, injected himself with morphine, and climbed back into his tank. For 3 more days, he directed fire, called out enemy positions, and held his sector. On December 19th, a German shell found his tank. Reuben Rivers died at his post, still gripping the radio handset. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor 53 years later, after decades of institutional delay and racial obstruction. The Germans expected Tillet to fall in hours. The 761st held it for 6 days and never gave an inch. When the weather cleared and Allied air power returned, the German offensive collapsed. The road to Antwerp remained closed. The Reich had lost its last throw of the dice. And the Black Panthers had done something that would reverberate through the chain of command. They had performed, under the most brutal conditions imaginable, at a level equal to or exceeding any white armored unit in the European theater. But words like equal and exceeding were abstractions in after-action reports. What happened next was something else, something visceral and undeniable. By January 1945, the 761st was pushing into Germany itself, part of the massive Allied drive to the Rhine. They rolled through villages with medieval churches and half-timbered houses, through industrial towns where factories still smoldered, through farmland where the soil was rich and black beneath the snow. And everywhere they went, the civilian population emerged to watch. These were not military surrenders. These were ordinary Germans, Hausfrauen and shopkeepers, farmers and school teachers, people who had lived through the Weimar Republic, cheered Hitler's rise, and now watched their 1,000-year Reich crumble before their eyes. They expected occupation. They expected revenge. They expected brutality. The propaganda machine had told them the Americans were barbarians, that their black troops especially were little better than animals. Dr. Joseph Goebbels himself had broadcast warnings that German women should flee before the Negro hordes arrived, painting lurid pictures of atrocities that existed only in the fever dreams of Nazi racism. What they got instead were men like Sergeant Warren G.H. Cressy, who would end the war as the most decorated soldier in the 761st, with a field commission to lieutenant, and a reputation for treating captured German soldiers with professional courtesy. They got tankers who shared their rations with starving children, who helped repair water pumps, who treated the wounded regardless of uniform. They got discipline, not vengeance, competence, not chaos. And slowly, in village after village, something unprecedented began to happen. The salutes, it started with veterans, old men who had fought in the First World War, who understood military bearing when they saw it. They would stand as the tanks passed, and their hands would rise, not in surrender, but in recognition. Soldier to soldier. Then younger men joined, then women, then even children mimicking their parents. By the time the 761st reached Bavaria, the phenomenon was widespread enough that it appeared in intelligence reports and journalists' dispatches. German civilians, wrote war correspondent Tresvant Anderson, salute Negro troops with evident respect, a sight unimaginable 6 months ago. The German military mind understood one language above all others: Leistung, performance, results, effectiveness. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on those principles, and now, rolling through the streets of Munich and Nuremberg, they saw those principles embodied in soldiers their ideology had declared impossible. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. How could Untermenschen operate such complex machinery? How could primitives execute combined arms tactics? How could the inferior race defeat the Herrenvolk in battle after battle? The only answer was the one they couldn't speak aloud: The ideology was a lie. All of it. The racial hierarchy, the pseudoscience, the comfortable myth that had justified 12 years of tyranny. It was a lie. And these black tankers in their dust-covered Shermans were the walking, breathing proof. Among the artifacts preserved from the 761st's service, one item appears again and again in memoirs and oral histories. Chocolate bars. The simple Hershey's tropical bar, designed to resist melting in Pacific heat, became an unintentional symbol of the gulf between American abundance and German deprivation. The German army in 1945 was starving. Rations had been cut to near starvation levels. Soldiers subsisted on ersatz bread and watery soup. Civilians were worse off. The average caloric intake in German cities was below 800 calories per day. People were eating potato peels and boiling leather. And then the Americans arrived, with their trucks full of supplies, their vast logistical network, their casual abundance. Tankers of the 761st would toss chocolate bars to German children watching from doorways, not to humiliate, but simply because they could. Because in the America they came from, an America that oppressed them, segregated them, denied them basic dignity, there was still enough to share. The chocolate became legend. Years later, German civilians would recall not just that black American soldiers gave them food, but that they did so with a kind of matter-of-fact generosity that communicated more than any propaganda leaflet ever could. This was what American power looked like. Not just the tanks and planes, but the industrial capacity to keep those machines running. Not just the soldiers, but the society that could feed, clothe, and equip millions of them. The Germans had been told America was decadent, weak, mongrelized by racial mixing. Instead, they discovered a nation so powerful it could fight a two-ocean war, rebuild Europe through Lend-Lease, and still have chocolate bars for enemy children. The chocolate was proof, physical, edible proof, and it made a mockery of every speech Hitler had ever given about American degeneracy. On April 30th, 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion entered the forests near Gunskirchen Lager, a subcamp of Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. The smell reached them first, a stench so overwhelming that hardened combat veterans vomited in their tanks. Then they saw the dead, stacked like cordwood, then the living, if they could be called that. Skeletal figures in striped rags, more ghosts than humans, who stumbled toward the Shermans with arms outstretched. The tankers, men who had seen the worst of industrial warfare, wept openly. They shared every ration they had. They radioed for medical teams, supplies, anything. Many of the survivors were Jews, political prisoners, Roma, victims of the same racial ideology that had declared the 761st's existence impossible. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here were black Americans, themselves victims of systemic racism, liberating the ultimate victims of Nazi racial theory. A Jewish survivor named Sally Ganor later wrote, "We were liberated by black American soldiers. At first we couldn't believe it. Under the Nazis, we were taught that black people were subhuman. Now, these same subhumans were our saviors. They shared their food with us. They carried us to medical tents. They cried for us." In that moment, every lie of the Reich was revealed. The 761st had expected combat. They had prepared for warfare, for tactics, for death. They had not prepared to become liberators, to stand as living contradictions to genocidal ideology. But history had cast them in that role, and they performed it with the same professionalism they brought to everything else. By the time the battalion was deactivated in June 1945, they had fought for 183 consecutive days, liberated more than 30 towns, inflicted massive casualties on German forces, and earned a Presidential Unit citation. They had done everything asked of them, and more. They had proven, beyond any shadow of doubt, that courage and competence had no color. And still, when they returned to America, many of them rode in segregated trains. They came home to the same Jim Crow laws, the same discrimination, the same second-class citizenship. The nation they had bled for still refused them service at lunch counters. But something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the edifice of American apartheid. The WWII campaign, Victory Abroad, Victory at Home, had planted seeds that would germinate in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. The soldiers of the 761st became living arguments against segregation. How could America justify treating men like Reuben Rivers and Warren Cressy as inferiors when they had proven themselves equals or superiors to any white soldier on the battlefield? President Harry Truman, influenced partly by the combat record of units like the 761st, would desegregate the armed forces in 1948. It was one of the first major civil rights victories of the post-war era. The road from Bavaria to Birmingham ran through the service of these black tankers. In the town square of Coburg today, there is a small memorial. It was erected in 1995, 50 years after liberation, by the town council. It acknowledges the arrival of American forces, but until recently, it made no specific mention of the 761st, or that the liberators were black soldiers. That erasure was typical. For decades, the contributions of black soldiers were minimized, footnoted, or simply ignored in official histories. But the old people of Coburg remember. In interviews conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, elderly Germans recalled that day in January 1945 with surprising clarity. Frau Bergmann, then a young woman of 19, said, "They were so professional, so disciplined, not at all what we had been told to expect. My father, who had been in the Wehrmacht in the First War, said they were better soldiers than many German units he'd seen. It made him question everything else we'd been told." Herr Müller, the former Nazi Party official who saluted that morning, never spoke publicly about his reasons. He died in 1962, his motivations unrecorded. But his daughter remembered. After the war, my father burned his party membership card and his uniform. He never explained exactly why, but he would sometimes mention those soldiers, the black American soldiers. He said they had showed him that everything was a lie. I think seeing them broke something in him, some fundamental belief he'd held. He was never the same. These were small transformations, individual reckonings, but multiply them across thousands of villages, millions of civilians, and a picture emerges of an ideology collapsing, not just militarily, but intellectually and morally. The Germans expected subhuman savages. They got professionals. They expected chaos. They got discipline. They expected confirmation of their racial theories. They got refutation, rolled out in 30-ton Sherman tanks. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion is not a story of racial harmony or easy redemption. It is a story about the power of performance to shatter ideology. The German salutes were not gestures of affection or apology. They were admissions of defeat at a deeper level than military conquest. They were acknowledgments that the worldview which had justified genocide, conquest, and tyranny was built on lies so transparent that even its own adherents couldn't maintain belief when confronted with contrary evidence. The men of the 761st didn't set out to be symbols. They wanted to be soldiers, to serve, to survive. Many just wanted the respect they deserved. But history made them more than that. They became proof, undeniable, physical, combat-tested proof that human worth is not determined by melanin or bloodline or the pseudoscientific ravings of dictators. When German civilians stood in the streets of Bavaria and saluted Black American soldiers, they were not just surrendering to military force. They were surrendering to truth. The painful, necessary truth that their leaders had lied to them, that their sacrifices had been in service of evil, that the natural order they'd been promised was a fiction designed to justify the unjustifiable. Those salutes were the sound of an ideology dying, not with a whimper, but with a snap, the sharp crack of a hand meeting a forehead in respect. The fog lifted over Bavaria that January morning, as fog always does. The sun broke through, pale and cold, illuminating the frost on the birch trees and the mud on the tank treads, and the faces of soldiers who had traveled 4,000 miles to fight for a freedom they themselves were denied. The column moved on. They had a war to finish, a Reich to destroy, a world to set right. Behind them, in the windows and doorways, the German civilians lowered their hands and returned to whatever life remained in the ruins of their nation. But something had changed. In the mind of every person who stood and saluted, a small revolution had occurred. An old certainty had been replaced with uncomfortable doubt, and doubt, once planted, grows. The 761st Tank Battalion rolled on toward the Rhine, toward Berlin, toward history. They carried chocolate bars and spare rations, and mechanical expertise, and courage tested in the furnace of combat. They carried the hopes of a community back home that needed heroes, needed proof that the fight was worth it, needed evidence that the arc of history could be bent. And they carried, though they couldn't have known it then, the future. A future where a black man could rise to command those same armed forces, could sit in the Oval Office, could look back at the service of men like Reuben Rivers and Warren Cressy and see not an anomaly, but a foundation. The chocolate bars are long gone, melted and consumed and forgotten. The Shermans rust in museum yards. The men themselves have mostly passed now, joining their brothers in arms in whatever peace lies beyond war. But the salutes remain, preserved in memories and memoirs and oral histories, a strange and powerful testament to the moment when evil ideology collided with undeniable truth and shattered. In the end, the Germans saluted because they had no choice. The evidence was too overwhelming, the contradiction too stark. You cannot maintain a fiction when reality is staring you in the face from the turret of a tank, dark-skinned and competent, and utterly, completely real. That is the power of truth. It doesn't argue. It doesn't debate. It simply is. Unavoidable and irresistible, rolling forward on steel treads through morning fog, crushing lies beneath its weight, leaving behind not just military defeat, but ideological ruin. The salutes of Bavaria were not the end of racism, neither in Germany nor America. The struggle for true equality would continue for decades, continues still. But they were a moment when the mask slipped, when the lie was exposed, when even those who had believed most fervently in racial hierarchy were forced to admit, if only to themselves, that they had been wrong. And in the economy of history, such moments matter. They become points of no return, lines in the sand, markers that say, after this, everything must change. The Black Panthers of the 761st Tank Battalion didn't just liberate towns and camps. They liberated something more fundamental. They liberated truth from the prison of ideology. And that liberation, unlike territory gained and lost, could never be reversed. The fog over Bavaria lifted that morning. It has never returned.